to call me the expert in public engagement, but I do want to say that all of this content I'm about to share is coming from our staff collectively. And so I do hope, especially with the size of this group, that we can answer some questions, and I would invite John and Nick and Paul to chime in. And this is something that when we are structuring our processes for public engagement, we're constantly doing it together, collaboratively, and thinking, bouncing ideas off of, what might work, what doesn't work. And so it's really a collective process. But as John said, a lot of this content is coming from that first chapter in the leadership guide, framing a process for public engagement. And I'll just quickly kind of frame what I'm not going to talk about is really the nuts and bolts of public invitation. We've done a session on inviting the public and engaging for equity and inclusion and diversity. I'll point in different places of this presentation to other chapters in the guide that get into those details. And so this presentation is really about that upfront work of thinking about, why do I want to engage the public? When is it appropriate to do that? How we might do that? And then I'll share some examples of processes that I've been involved in, both at VCRD, which we do regularly, our community visit program, but then also another process that I've been involved in locally here as a Conservation Commission member in Huntington, where I live. So let me just pull up, I'll pull up my PowerPoint here and share the screen. One moment. PowerPoint. And, bear with me for 1 second while I just tell my PowerPoint what I want it to do. Okay, are you now seeing just the slide? John, is that good? Okay, cool. All right, so as I said, framing a process for public engagement, deciding when to engage, why to engage, and how. Engaging the public is critical when we, as John was just saying, when we embark in a community on a certain project, or if we're looking for input more broadly to kind of steer direction in a community. Either way, engagement is important, but depending on the questions you're trying to get answered and the type of engagement you need, there are different structures and processes that you can use to accomplish that goal of bringing in the public voice. So I'm just going to walk through some pointers in each of these and then share some ways that might help structure. So first of all, when to engage. I think oftentimes community leaders, project leaders know that engagement is important, but what we really want to avoid is engagement for the sake of engagement, right? Like just to say, oh yeah, we included people's voices. It's really important that engagement is meaningful and that people that are involved feel like they were heard and meaningfully included in the development of a project that's meant to be community-based. So this list here is just a guidance around when is it important to engage. And I would say it's important for at least one of these to be true if you're going to go and reach out to the public. So the first, early in the process, this one is really critical. I think oftentimes where you see tension coming up in communities around projects is when people feel like they've been engaged too late in the process. Like there's nothing worse than somebody coming into a meeting, asking for their opinion, and then them realizing, I think decisions have already been made here, and this is just for show. And so early in the process is really important to kind of engage voices from the beginning. The other is if the project will affect many. That's fairly self-explanatory, but if the project in your community is something that's going to affect a whole neighborhood, the whole community, a whole road in your town, whatever it is, that's probably an important time to engage folks and bring in their opinion in one way or another. If a project is complex or controversial. So, one thing that we find when a community is grappling with an issue, if something is complex or people have very different opinions on a topic, I'll use the example in Huntington recently of a cell phone tower that would be constructed in the community. you can imagine that's pretty controversial. And so it's almost like sometimes it feels like public engagement process is kind of like a form of community therapy in a way. It's an opportunity for people to air out, to say out loud, or to write down what they're feeling about an issue, and it helps people to kind of grapple with those ideas and have an understanding of different perspectives on the topic. You know, if we are only engaging from our own little, you know, only kind of like with people that share our opinion, or just kind of putting it out into the, you know, front porch forum, or shouting out our opinion, it's hard to understand people's different perspective and feel like we've come to a common understanding. People's sense power is not balanced. This is a really important one. If either you're hearing that people are feeling left out of a conversation or a project that you're developing, or if you're realizing that there are voices missing, that could be a really important place to build some engagement. We worked with the town of Londonderry recently, where there was a group working on some initiatives for the future, and they started to realize, you know, if we're going to be successful, we really need to bring in other voices. And so they brought us in to help to really boost the community conversation, to help balance out that sense of power or decision making. And then there's no community consensus. And that's kind of similar to the project is complex or controversial. You know, this is an opportunity for people to come together and get a sense for what their neighbors are thinking and needing, and come to some common decisions around what they see as important for the future, whether it's priorities for a community or even just an individual project. All right, so I think if there's anything that is important in thinking about framing a process for public engagement, I find this table really useful. What this is trying to get at is, what level of engagement are you looking for in your project? And this is so important, number one, for you to be clear about as you're framing a process, but also for you to communicate to the people involved in the process that you are building. So you can see on this table, you have goal on one side, and then you have possible tools on the other. So there's kind of a spectrum of public engagement, and then tools that can match what those needs are. So in some cases, it may be important that you need to inform the public. You need to provide information, help people understand there's a project going on, and you just need to share information. And so you have tools like flyers and newsletters, websites, panel discussion, tabling, front porch forum, Facebook, online forums is an opportunity to inform the public. Consult. So this is where you're soliciting public comment on an issue or decision. So this is when, you know, I use that cell tower example, right? In Huntington, the town didn't really have the ability to make decisions on a cell tower coming into town, but it was important to consult with the community and get a sense for, if the town were to comment on this project, what do people think in town? What are they feeling? Are they nervous? What are the particular concerns? So that was a place where forum, you know, focused forum groups or surveys, or a facilitated meeting where people could share their comments, but it was clear that they weren't there to make a decision about the project. That was clear from the beginning, but they were soliciting input as the town was coming to a sense of kind of how they would get involved in the project. So the next kind of tier of engagement is involved. So this is where you're working directly with the public throughout the effort to ensure that ideas are understood and respected. So things like visioning exercises, deliberative forums, small group discussions. So you're gathering input, you're bringing people into the process, but it's clear that the people engaged aren't making final decisions around the topic for the project. Collaborate, partnering with the community in developing alternatives and choosing actions. So this is where you might build an advisory board of community members, or have some participatory decision making. And then the final tier here is empower. So this is one where it's very clear from the beginning that the final decision in this process is completely up to the community, and the community owns that project or initiative. So they're not working on behalf of a larger advisory board that's making final decision and taking action. They're not just gathering input towards final decision. They are moving through a process where they're going from coming up with ideas to making decisions. So you'll see the word, voting in there. There's a vote for final decision, and then even signing up to work on projects. So that's that kind of like, think of it as an engagement spectrum. And like I said, the most important thing here is to determine this upfront as you're developing your process, and then make sure that you are being clear about that from the beginning. All of these are okay. They're all great ways to engage the public. It's just a matter of making sure that you're clear in the verbs that you're using. If you're advertising a forum to share information, you could say something like, come and hear more about the playground project, or come learn more about next steps in the community forest, whatever, the topic is. Whereas if you move all the way down the spectrum to empower, you're going to be using verbs more like, come and vote on what's most important to you. Come make decisions about the future of the community forest. That you'll adjust how you're communicating that. And then as you open any sort of meeting or survey, you would describe what this process is all about and how people are being engaged. And you'll see that makes a big difference in terms of how genuinely people feel they've been heard as you walk through the process that you've built. So how to engage. So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. So in terms of building your process and what it looks like, reviewing those potential strategies in the chart, and think about, what's the best fit for your issue? Is this a project that you're working on and you're at a point where you need to share the project with the public, and you might hold a forum where you share some details and show a PowerPoint with before and after photos or something like that? Or do you need to build a multi-step process where you're actually asking the town to make decisions about the future of the community or of a certain project? And so, I put in here, frame the questions. When we are approached by a community or a group that is looking for some support in building a process, that's the first thing that we ask them is, what are the questions you're trying to ask? Like, being really clear about, when you have the community gathered together, or when you put your survey out there in the community, come down to those kind of clear questions that you want to find out. So if you just invite people to a forum publicly, and people show up and you don't have those kind of clear questions framed, it can be kind of murky and people don't know how they're, how to frame what they want to share. But if you're asking them, what is your vision for the future of the community store in town? Or what are your ideas for how we could use the vacant school building? Like, think about what are those questions that you want to get to, and then maybe how is that a question that can be answered in a one-night forum? Is that a question? Is that a series of questions that need to be answered over the course of a couple different meetings? And kind of pull that together with what makes the most sense for what you're trying to get at. Also, the next one here is probably the most critical. And again, I'm not going to get into the details of this one, but being open and inclusive and transparent and clear in the process that you're developing. We've talked a little bit about clarity around the questions and the goals for any particular process, but you'll also want it to be inclusive. And the last thing that you want is to kind of decide, we're going to do this process, we're going to create a meeting, and then we're going to put it out there, and maybe 10 or 15 people show up and they're all already involved in the project and already know about it. Like, it takes a lot of time and energy and work, but to put the time in, dig into the community and really look at what are all the different voices that need to be included in this. Who are the people that don't typically show up to meetings that we need to bring in, and how can we engage their voice? Maybe there are different strategies. Maybe we have a public forum, but also a survey where we can collect some input. And there are 2 chapters in the leadership guide that could be useful here. One is inviting the public. That one really digs into all the different ways to reach out to the community. We also have a recorded session where we talked about that and had a couple different examples that you can revisit and listen to if you're in a process now and want to have some strategies to reach out further. But then also there's a chapter on engaging for for diversity and equity and inclusion, and making sure that you're being inclusive, and the kind of a set of questions to ask yourself as you go through a process like this to make sure that you're creating a process that's open and inviting and welcoming to everyone in the community. The other thing I just want to mention is considering your capacity. So, you know, when it comes to building a process like this, so we're a staff of, how are we, 5, 6 now, full-time people that do this work in communities. It does take a lot of work to pull a community together, to build surveys, to do that deep invitation process. We have seen many communities successfully do this on their own. We've seen communities build a process. They have incredible volunteers that go out, do the invitation, put together the community dinners, create, you know, creative opportunities for engagement. But it does take a lot of work and energy. So just consider, like, I have the facilitation needs met in my community. Are there people who can help to lead these discussions? Are there people who can design a survey or a flyer? Do we have the space in town, you know, our town hall or our school, or where can we meet in the community? And do we have the time and energy and volunteer capacity to really dig in and do this well? In many cases, communities do, and they pulled this off on their own. But on the next slide, I will just share with you, there are organizations and individuals and businesses in Vermont that lead this kind of work for communities. And so it is something to consider as you're embarking on a process in your own community. Would it make sense to bring someone in that could help with part or all of a process that you're developing? And I'll share with you some examples in a moment. And then listen, learn, and adjust. So this is really important. I mentioned at the beginning that at VCRD, as we're building our processes for engagement, we're always adjusting and learning. You're going to hear feedback no matter what, right? Like if you hold a big public process in your town, people complain, people share ideas, people, you know, they have ideas on how things could be done differently, and you don't need to adjust for every little piece of input that you get. But if you're starting to hear concerns, if you hear like, gosh, there's people who just aren't here at the table or aren't in the room for these forums, you know, deep listening is a really important part of engagement, and hearing, okay, it sounds like people are worried. You know, in an example I'll give in a moment, in Huntington, you know, we got an email on about a process about recreation, and the head of the VAST, or the snowmobile group in town, emailed us and said, you know, we don't feel like we've been engaged in this process at all. And it can be easy to hear that and go, you know, we tried, we sent the email out, we sent it around to everyone, but it's important to, I think, take that in and say, what could we do a little differently? Or where is there an opportunity to adjust our process so that that group or other groups feel like they're a part of it? And so that listening and learning and being flexible is important. And, you know, public engagement is an ongoing process often. And I'll illustrate that in some of the examples we have. It's often not just a survey or a forum. Oftentimes it's a ongoing process of, you may have to engage in the beginning to collect ideas. And then once decisions are made around ideas that you'll move forward, you might need to engage again on the particulars of some of those ideas. And then you might have to go to the select board and hold a public forum on a funding issue. And, you know, it's often an ongoing piece of work in a community, and it's almost never done. And so that listening and learning and adjusting is important over time. So here's, and I know, John, you make these presentations available, right? Following this. So I don't expect you to look at all of these now, but I put the links in there for the future, that there are many, and this is not an exhaustive list. These are like the first that came to my mind, but I listed some different organizations and individuals who can support some of this work if a group or a community were to decide it was important to bring in support. So VCRD, obviously, you know, we do deep engagement processes that we'll describe in a moment, but we also help consult with one-time processes. People will come to us and say, hey, we need to gather public engagement on the future of a community store in Chelsea. Can you help us set up a process? And we'll sometimes, where we have capacity, do some consulting or guidance or even some one-time facilitation to support that kind of work. And then these other organizations, Community Workshop, Creative Discourse is one that really focuses on issues around racial equity and inclusion. Slow Democracy, Susan Clark is a close partner of ours who does great engagement and kind of, she actually developed a lot of this chapter that this workshop is focused on. And then Delia Clark, who's actually Susan's sister. So one of those names is probably not spelled right, but Delia Clark is an incredible, like, global consultant and design these processes. Regional planning commissions can be really helpful in designing this work. And then land use planning and design, we're going to hear from David Raphael from LandWorks, who designs charrettes and processes like this all the time. And then also SE Group and Fairweather Consulting or a couple of others. And so finally, I just want to share two different examples to illustrate maybe examples on two different parts of that engagement spectrum, that chart that I described. So the first one is one, so I serve on the Conservation Commission in Huntington, and we've recently gone through a years-long process around acquiring a new town, or we call it the community forest in town. And so this is a process that over time has used many different strategies from that list in the chart that I described. But I think it's important, this one really falls, when you look at that chart, this one falls on that involve kind of level, where the community throughout this whole process has been deeply engaged in sharing their ideas, sharing their opinion, sharing their thoughts, commenting. But in the end, the final decision has often been up to either the select board, actually is always, right, up to the select board when it comes to town-owned property. But now there's also a stewardship committee who's making decisions on the stewardship plan, but then ultimately that'll go to the select board for final approval. So really the leadership in town has final decision, but that doesn't mean that you can't meaningfully engage the community. And you can imagine there are some topics in here that are fairly controversial. Hunting in the town forest, for example, is one that has been discussed a lot on Front Porch Forum and in public forums. And so just a quick kind of overview, this all started with actually a charrette kind of design conversation years ago around the future of recreation in Huntington. So it started with a very broad conversation where people got to do some mapping exercises and dot voting and share their thoughts on the future, and ultimately interest in a community forest. No decisions on it, but interest was expressed around acquiring a new community forest. And over time, there were surveys done to ask about what people would like to see. If we were to acquire property, what kind of things would they like to see? And then finally, we did identify a property and ultimately just completed the purchase of a community forest in town. And then a stewardship committee was formed, and they had to quickly think about how are we going to engage the community in designing this stewardship plan. We ultimately make the plan and the select board ultimately approves it, but we need to engage the public. And not only that, we have to engage them during a pandemic where they can't meet in person. And so they really had to shift how they were doing this engagement, and ultimately created a series of public forums where, and that you'll see the little series here on the page, where they took different topics about stewardship, natural resources, recreation, hunting and fishing was its own forum. So rather than shying away from the topic of hunting because it was controversial, they put it out there as, here, we're going to talk about this hunting thing. We're going to put it right out there. And so they held these series. They had an expert come and share their perspective, and then they had a facilitated forum, a mix of professional and just community facilitators that led the conversation, where people could feel heard, could share their input, but it was clear in each of those meetings that they weren't there to make decisions. They were there to share what they thought. So that's one example on that involve. And then John's going to share in just a moment. I figure rather than me talking on Zoom, you can watch a video of me talking, I guess, where we are going to share our community visit process. So the community visit that we manage is a form of a public engagement process that we use, and it really falls on that empower level of the chart, where this is for the community to come together and to make final decisions and ultimately to work on initiatives that they select. And so we're just going to play a quick video that will walk through and give you a little taste of the community visit process. Some of you have been involved in them before in your own communities, but some of you may not have been. And so this one is from Linden, and hopefully the video works. And if not, it'll just be me talking about the community visit. So John, let me stop sharing. Okay.
All right.
The community visit process is a 3-month series of public meetings. So the first step in the community visit process is Community Visit Day. We invite the whole community together to a series of public forums. And in these forums, we ask folks to say, what are the assets in this topic area? What are the challenges? And most importantly, what are the ideas for action?
We talk about actions. I want to see these actions take place. I want to be able to see the younger generation stay here and not leave, and see how important this small town is.
Yeah. After Community Visit Day, we look at all the notes that come from those community forums and we bring them back to the community a month later for Community Meeting Day. We put all the ideas up on the wall and have a dot voting exercise to come to those top priorities. And that night, we ask people to sign up for task forces to help to move those forward.
I'm not prepared to talk much about.
In the sessions today, we talked about all the positive things that were going on and how we can maybe enhance those positive things. And it isn't something that one person can achieve, it's a community.
They're making connections already of things that we didn't realize. So that's very impressive. It's just awesome.
In the final step of the process, we have what we call Community Resource Day. And we bring with us a visiting resource team of experts and leaders, folks that could offer technical assistance, folks that might be able to bring financial assistance, and also, maybe other community leaders who have done these things in their towns.
What I think is one very positive aspect of this is the visiting team, because these are experts, people who have done this before. They have the expertise that we don't have, but maybe we have the fervor, the enthusiasm, because it's our town. So you get their expertise and our heart, you mix those together and you ought to have a good outcome, which I think we will.
The process isn't about what we think is best for the town. It's not about what people in Montpelier or DC think is best for the town. It's all about what's important to the community and what the community wants to get done together.
We're excited to partner with VCRD because we know that they excel in engaging a community and helping a community identify its own priorities. It helps a community kind of rediscover its identity and think about the future of who it wants to be for the next generation. And it just feels, like democracy in action, the real deal. So it's really very inspiring.
Lincoln called democracy an experiment. It's not something that's done. It's not something you can take for granted. It's something that we make real, and in Vermont we make it real town by town every day.
Great, thanks, John. So that's just another example, and it doesn't kind of go into the details there of all the pieces, but you'll remember all those different tools on the chart. The community engagement process, or the community visit process, walks through, it uses surveys, it uses visioning exercises, it uses public forums, and ultimately voting on decisions. And so it's an ongoing process that kind of utilizes that series of tools. So I think I'll leave it there. And I know that's kind of a little bit broad and abstract content, but it's because there's no kind of, there's no template or form for exactly what public engagement you should use. It really is kind of deciding what's going to work for the project that you have, what's going to work for the questions that you want to ask of the community, and then just getting at how to piece that together to get those questions answered. And like I said, VCRD is always here to help build those structures and consult on what might work. So John, do you want me to go ahead and pass it over? So David Raphael is with us. I mentioned LandWorks on one of my slides. Oftentimes communities are coming out of decision-making processes like a community visit, and then digging into a project and consulting with folks like David in terms of bringing the community in on what's next. So David's going to share some examples of what processes he runs look like on the ground. Thanks, David.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, hi, good morning, everyone. I see some familiar names and faces on this call. So bear with me if I say something that you know about or might remember. When John asked me to do this, I thought he was making a big mistake because I can't possibly condense a career's worth of work, a lifetime of commitment to this kind of process in about 8 minutes, but I'm going to try. So give me a chance here. I want to start sort of at the very beginning for me personally, and why from when I was still a student, the importance of engagement and working with people came right to the fore. I remember attending a lecture when I was in architecture school by a nationally known architect who we were all excited to hear about. And one thing stuck with me about that presentation was when he talked about his beautiful buildings and his slides, somebody asked him, why aren't there any people in the pictures? And he said, well, I don't want people in the pictures of my architecture because I want you to be able to experience the sculptural and design, qualities of the building, as the foremost takeaway. And from that point on, it struck me that we have architects and designers who kind of work from their thinking out rather than the collective thinking of a community in. And the role and importance of people in the process, although it can be challenging and messy, is absolutely essential for the success of any community planning or design projects. And even the fanciest buildings in the world need to work for their occupants. And the only way they can do that is if the designer and the planner and the people building or supporting the project respect and engage the constituents for that project. So that leads to my 6 basic takeaways or principles that I've always ascribed to in community engagement, which again has been an absolute essential part of just about every project we've been involved with through the years, and yours truly has as well. And the first one really is sort of going to work with everyone and going to everyone. So in other words, that notion, as Jenna was mentioning a moment ago, of inclusion begins really right at the start of any project. And you want to know who the constituency is and how to get to them. Well, in one of the first projects I ever did here in Vermont, back in the mid-1980s, I will never forget, it was the Bristol streetscape in Bristol, Vermont. And before anything was done, I found myself walking into every single business along Main Street and talking with the owners and the property owners about this project, what their concerns are, what their hopes were, so forth and so on. And one thing that came out of that was we want to get rid of the power lines. And that was also a wonderful opportunity to go to somebody else, which was in this case, CVPS, and getting them to think about what could be done to remove the power lines from Bristol Main Street. With that in mind, and then with the contacts I had made by walking the street and literally going door to door, the final design of Bristol streetscape came into being. And indeed, the power lines were moved off the street. And I'm very proud to say that, how many years later, many decades later, the framework that we put into place, and when I say we, the community, is still there. The neck downs, ironically, the bulb outs on the streetscape were put into place right at the get-go. Then there was some controversy around them. They were taken out, and then they were put back. So you can create, I think, lasting results, by taking it to the people. I mean, surveys, workshops, events are all really important, but you know what? Sometimes you have to go door to door. That's my first point. The second one was, build things and build relationships. Hands-on opportunities in these kinds of projects, never fail, I think, to engage people and allow those of us who are involved in the planning and design process to kind of build relationships with those people. many of the projects that I've done lately or in the last 10 years have followed, the community visit process, which I think has absolutely revolutionized how we plan and design in Vermont in all good ways. And in Virgens, we wanted to get people involved. We wanted to get the word out. And, we thought of this notion of sort of pop-up activities and sort of urban interventions. And so in Virgens, I kind of created this idea with some others to build a kiosk, an actual physical kiosk, while we're in the planning process. So there was something tangible that came out of this right at the get-go. And that kiosk became a place for announcements and so forth. And it brought out a whole bunch of people on 2 weekend days to actually help design and build the kiosk in place. So that's a great, I think, example from my experience of sort of, building things and sort of involving people in that process. Another thing about going to everyone, and I mentioned CVPS, is when I worked out in Wyoming, and I'm still there actually, and one of the reasons I'm still there is because before the project ever started, I took it upon myself to locate and meet with the public works director. That individual in many communities is the one person often who's going to live with the results of what you do in the public realm. And by making the connection with that individual before I even had this job, before our company was even hired, led to a long-term and lasting relationship. And how many years later, 15 years later, I am still going out to Jackson, Wyoming, still working with the public works director, who, by the way, is now the town manager. So that's sort of the building relationship piece about it. I think the next thing I would say is, do fun stuff. I think it's so important when you're involved in this process, and I certainly feel this way, not to take yourself too seriously and to really have fun. And when people are having fun, good things come from that. For example, examples of fun things that we've done is in Mount Holly, we wanted to get the community involved in rewriting their town plan and then hopefully developing a zoning ordinance, which they didn't have. But Mount Holly was sort of a disconnected community. It's cut in half by a major state highway, Route 103. And we came up with the idea of doing a tour of Mount Holly. And so on one Saturday, we arranged to have the school buses from the community all pull up to the town hall. And we had a huge turnout of people. And we took the school buses all around the town, and all day long, I heard people say, wow, I didn't know that. And whoa, what an interesting part of town this is. And it really built not only a momentum for the project, but it built a stronger sense of community for that project. Another example of sort of a building relationship and building things is like when I first went into White River Junction in the early 1990s, we took over an empty storefront. And so that was an ongoing place where people came and went and participated in the process. And that led to another thing, which is that notion of do fun stuff, where we went to the vocational technical school and got the students there to build a model of downtown White River Junction. And that was then used throughout the whole process to look at White River revitalization, which has been ongoing, I think, successfully ever since then. Another example of sort of doing fun stuff was very recently with the Middlebury Pop-Up Park. The town manager came to me and said, what can we do with this empty derelict space that eventually is going to become part of the new railroad bridge tunnel project? And we put in a pop-up park that was not without controversy, by the way, because it attracted a group of local skateboarders. We had skateboarders in the team that built the park, which was a group of my students from the university. And we also collaborated with Middlebury College. So you had 2 colleges and groups of students working on different aspects of this project that resulted not only in a skateboard place that again attracted skateboarders from all around town, but a playground, a little contemporary playground that then got noticed in the kids newspaper and all of a sudden became very popular. I won't go into the end run of that story, but it was a good example of how you can have fun, engage a lot of different people, and really, you know, involve the community in the process. You know, another example of fun stuff very recently was with my students at UVM in a project called Finding Lost Space, where we reached out to the community of Winooski and developed a collaboration with them to look at forgotten and overlooked places in Winooski, and also that allowed the students to have contact with community members and learn on the ground, you know, how you plan and the process for that in changing outdoor spaces. Next point I want to make very quickly, that's been sort of at the very center of what I've always done and what we've always done in communities is summed up by 3 words: kids, kids, kids. Wonderful way to reach parents and to engage the community is to go through the children, and not in a user kind of way, but to engage them and to tap into their thinking, because after all, they are the future. And some of the most wonderful things that you know, I've had an opportunity to be part of has been with children in communities. For example, one great day we had, and I think Ashley Parker's on the phone from or on the Zoom from South Burlington, was when I went into the elementary school near the city center park, which I was part of the process for, and had a workshop with the students, sort of got a sense of what the kids wanted in that park, and then they all walked on a field trip to the park, and we had a great day with the kids there. And you know, involving kids throughout these types of processes through the years has never been anything but a huge success and a lot of fun as well. And then, you know, two more quick things, and then I'll kind of let it go, is, you know, as Jenna mentioned and was on the slide, one of the last slides, you know, you've got to learn the lessons that you pick up along the way and not forget them. They are intrinsically and essentially valuable to you know, the success and the process itself. And so one lesson I learned very early on that I'll never forget was, very excited. I was hired. One of my first projects for LandWorks was to get rid of an old gas station and parking lot in downtown Brattleboro, where the Wells Fountain had been placed, and create a park there in front of the district courthouse. And the park was all designed. We'd had meetings, people had come to the meetings, but I hadn't really gone out into the community to kind of get the tenor and the feel. And as we were developing our final plans, a group emerged, you know, representing the differently abled people in the community, and said, you know, we hadn't been involved in the park, and we have some concerns. And the major concern was we had a major walkway that went through the heart of the park, and there were a couple of steps at a couple of junctures in the parkway. And they said, those of us who, you know, use wheelchairs, we're not going to be able to get up to the top of the park. That was something I heard loud and clear, and totally redesigned the park at my own expense, because I realized, you know, that was a tremendous oversight on our part, but that was a lesson I never forgot. And also, you know, translated into the notion of listening and the importance of listening to your constituency, to the constituency that's part of the process, and will live with the project and the effort after you leave. And that sort of leads to the last point I will leave you with, which I think, again, is sort of embedded in the guide, and I think emerges, you know, through the process, is the notion of civility, respect, and patience. That I know Paul is on the call, and Paul Costello did a phenomenal job in Danville with a project that took 10 years from start to finish to see its realization. And that project required us to do a lot of listening. We needed to respect where the select board was coming from, because they had concerns about maintenance, operation, and success. And I had to learn that you can't change things overnight, and that sometimes it takes a long time. When I started that project, I had brown hair and no grandchildren. When I finished that project, I had white hair and 5 grandchildren. So a whole lot of time had passed, but it was all positive. And you can drive through Danville today and I think see the extraordinary results of that long process. You talked about voting by dots. We call it dotmocracy. That's an opportunity for people to be involved and for everyone's opinion to be respected. But the most challenging thing I've had through the years is to be in a meeting where you have one rabble rouser, one person who either doesn't buy into the project, thinks it's a waste of money, waste of time. And the hardest thing you have to do is to listen and respect where that individual is coming from. And you know what? Over time, that person and his concerns or her concerns can actually have a very important impact. In my own little community, I got into an argument with somebody I trusted and respected about the notion of putting a cupola, which was part of the architecture of our town hall, back onto the building. And he didn't understand why we should do that. The cost and the maintenance was going to be more than the taxpayers could bear. I got upset with him, and then I calmed down because he's a good friend and I never expected him to, fight this initiative. But having learned to listen, I thought longer and talked longer with him. And I realized, you know what? He has a very, very important point. We're going to spend a lot of money and put something back on top of this historic building, but can the town afford to maintain it? Well, we took that thinking and we found a way to build a new cupola that doesn't require any sort of extensive maintenance over time. He came along and supported the project, and the town as a whole felt comfortable in taking on the cost. And the end result is that today we have a beautiful new cupola in its rightful place on top of our town hall. So, patience, learning to listen, having respect for what other people can contribute, even if they're rowdy, even if they get you angry or upset, is important and essential, I think, to the success of any community engagement process. So sorry for kind of pushing that all out, but I only had 8 or 10 minutes. I don't know if I fit that all in, but I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that folks might have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. That was a whirlwind, a lot packed in, and Jenna too. Like, boy, there's a lot of content in the last 40, 45 minutes there. So, at this point, we're a small enough group that I think we should open it up. First of all, I want to acknowledge some folks may have to drop off at 11. Do that. Don't worry about it if you need to or want to. But I just want to open it up for a group Q&A. We may go into breakouts if folks want to in a little bit, but I figure let's stay we're a small enough group that let's stay together and see. Anybody have any questions? Feel free to just sort of unmute or type something into chat. One of the things that I guess, maybe this is a question for both of you, is I guess, or to name something, attention around sort of schedule and urgency versus sort of deep listening. I tuned in recently to one of the Climate Commission sessions, and Susanna Davis, the Director of Racial Equity, was speaking there, and she talked about deadlines as a challenge sometimes. On the other hand, we want to see projects move forward. So I just wonder if either of you think about sort of how to navigate those tensions around urgency to move forward, but also allowing for some deep listening and engagement.
And just to follow up on that point, I also had a question about when you do that deep listening, what happens when you figure out that your process is actually completely flawed and you need to start over entirely? Like how do you, like if the deep listening results in you need to change everything, then what would you do?
Jenna, go ahead.
Yeah, well, so I think that's a really good question of the urgency versus the need to act. It's such a balancing act, because I think something that I see sometimes in communities is sometimes it's like wanting to engage and find all the answers is paralyzing. And so like groups get stuck in a place where it's like, sometimes it's easier to say like, well, we have to do surveying, we have to do inventorying, we have to do public engagement, like, and then it's like your group becomes a public engagement group instead of like a, you know, redeveloping a town hall group. And so I think there is a really important balance. You don't want to get stuck in like this constant surveying engagement. You want to take action and move forward. I think one way to find that balance is to build within your process opportunity for different ways to connect over time. So one example is in our community visit, for example, we've really adjusted the process over time to be much more, I think it used to be when I first started, it used to be that like community forums, if you attended the community forums at the beginning of the process, that was the opportunity to engage. You shared your ideas. If you could attend the dinner and the events, then that was the opportunity. And now I think of it more of like a 1 or even more month-long opportunity to share ideas, where we open up a survey that's open for several weeks, right? And so people can go on that survey anytime and share their ideas. That survey is online, but it's also in, you know, local general stores and the library and the town office. And so you have those different ways to engage. And then you can attend the forum too. And now in the kind of Zoom world, and I think moving forward, we're thinking about different ways that we could even have like a separate focus forum. Like maybe you have maybe you have a forum of business owners in town and you get their input that way. Maybe, you know, in Barrie, we were going to have I was really excited before the pandemic, we were going to have a forum with the deaf community and have an interpreter and be able to have their input. You could have a forum with moms of a local childcare center, whatever it is. Like if there are people you need to reach separately that probably aren't going to attend a meeting, may not go online and fill out a survey, but they might, you know, if you come to them specifically, they might engage in some way. So it kind of balances that, give multiple opportunities over time, but then you're going to have to close and move on and take action and try your best to come to hear the community and come to the next steps. And I don't know, David, if you have reflections on that, and then I want to get to Elle's question too.
Yeah, I'll just make 2 very quick comments, and I think you kind of led to these comments. One is you do have to be prepared to do work offline. In other words, you may have these events and forums, you may have surveys, and remember, surveys are excellent tools, but they also can be self-selective, that only the people who have the time or interest will do surveys some of the time. So the notion is you've got to try anything and everything, and that's where the offline activity is important. So as Jenna was saying, again, it's that notion of finding out who are the constituencies you need to engage who may not have come to the table. You've got to go to them. You've got to find the time between the forums or between the deadlines to get to them and to have their input. So I think that's really, really important. And following from that, it goes back to, you know, again, something that's in the guide, and that's something that's very important in the process, is the importance of having local leadership involved, who can also serve to address and work with those other constituencies, or to address problems that have merged in the forum or the workshop event, again, in between the sessions, to reach out and bring people along, or to hear their concerns so that they can be incorporated into the process without necessarily derailing that process. But it is an imperfect process, and sometimes you do have to adjust on the fly. So it's something to remember, that you've got to be flexible and willing to make changes or step up to the plate and put in more time if necessary.
Yeah, and to Elle's question, like it's hard. I mean, I have to say, I've never encountered a situation where someone's concern has made me want to scrap a process entirely. I feel like there's almost always opportunity to adjust in a way that incorporates somebody's concerns. And I also find, I mean, there are times where, I don't know, I want to say this without sounding like I'm being dismissive, because it's not dismissive, but there are some times where people's concerns, like, you don't need to answer every single concern. If one person is feeling that your process isn't, like, it has happened before that VCRD has been accused of I don't know, being aligned with the UN and bringing global UN sustainability goals to Vermont, whatever. Like people have different ideas about what happened. And that person, you know, comes to you and says, this whole process is fake and it's coming, whatever. Like sometimes there's not that much you can be done to make that person happy. However, you can do your best. And like, I think, and David spoke to this, which I think is really important, like engaging, understanding the landscape of the community in which you're going to be engaging and bringing people in early is really important so that that concern doesn't surprise you later. Like the community visit, the part that I didn't talk about in that video is the months that we spend kind of investigating the community beforehand, right? Where I ask people the question, who's going to be against this? Like, who doesn't want to see change in the community? Who is going to think that, you know, who's going to be opposed? And as long as they're not disruptive or like harmful in any way, I bring them to the opening meeting, that steering committee that helps to frame the process so that their voice, their concerns can be heard early on and doesn't surprise us later. So that, you know, we've certainly adjusted our process to accommodate concerns that people have, but never gotten to a point where we've kind of been shocked by some opposition and had to scrap it, if that makes sense. So it's that deep understanding early on that can be helpful.
You know, I want to name something else, I guess, in response, which is one of the lessons I've learned at VCRD from Jenna, from Paul Costello, from Margaret on our team, is simplicity is really important. People having a clear understanding. It's tempting to complexify a process to try to accommodate in a bunch of different ways. And if that complexification leads to confusion, you lose engagement, I guess. And so I just want to sort of name that as a little bit of a balancing act. And also, to some degree, I feel like people have an attention span for a public conversation that does run out at some point. You have capital in your community to engage them, and you have to be careful that, like, if you try to extend and extend and extend, you lose some of your audience and your engagement. And so I'm not saying, I feel like, Jenna, you just said something, there is no perfection when it comes to this. Like, it's really a matter of like doing the best that you can and understanding sort of where you have opportunities, I guess, as opposed to thinking that you're going to run a perfect process with all voices heard at to completion, and with a project that reflects all that input perfectly, I guess, because there's often a balancing that's necessary there.
Yeah.
Other questions? We're doing a lot of talking here, but I wonder, Jerry.
Yes, it looks like I desperately need your help. So this is one thing that I've been appreciating, Jenna and David. Thank you so much, and you too, John. So I have been in a situation where I've put together and along with some community leaders, and found that it was absolutely untenable, and so I had to start over, completely over. And then it took about a year to really educate not only our steering committee members, but the people that we were working with around that. So including Shires Housing and so forth down here in Bennington. Yeah, and so I've associated myself with the Green Island, Denmark, and created a company down here in Bennington called Green Island, Vermont, to help be the developer for European technologies and integrated technologies for fossil-free utility and housing. So we're in the process right now of we've gathered a fair amount of investors, and is happy. It's just been sort of falling in, but I'm getting in over my head. We've had found lawyers to great contacts, and worked with Goldstone Architecture and MSK Engineering. We're getting all that, finding a piece of property for a low-income housing, not low income, to accommodate all of us, like nurses and doctors and landscape architects and landscapers, and basically affordable housing.
The
And we're
missing
shooting-
middle, some people call it, right? The missing middle
yeah,
of housing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The people that can't afford to move to Bennington because being a teacher in Bennington of all places. So, so yeah, here we are. And some of your, Jenna and David, and John, your opinions were very valuable to me. And so, yeah, I could use your help.
Well,
you go, Jenna.
I was just gonna say, Jerry, I mean, it does, one of the, there is value in having an outside facilitator for sure. Like having someone that's a bit removed from a process, from an outcome that can, it's part of the value, I think, that the community visit process or David and his team or others brings to processes, is that separated outside neutral facilitator that doesn't have a stake in the game, I guess, at all. And so, yeah, I mean, we're always happy to kind of consult and advise in a way with communities or groups that are trying to design these processes. It all depends on kind of, capacity to be able to support and how involved we can get. But like I said in that slide, there are experts in this kind of work all over the state that can be supportive of that kind of thing. Have you connected with the Regional Planning Commission and you're in Bennington?
Actually, one of our steering committee members is Jeannie Jenkins. She's a select board chair. So so we're in somewhat good shape there. But
yeah, though the Regional Planning Commission is the kind of broader organization in all of Bennington County. Jim Sullivan down there might be good to connect with around thinking about planning around these types of projects you're talking about.
Yes, I have been. In fact, he's been helpful with some of the things, but I think they're pretty busy right now. I'm not sure how much contact they can have. But yes, I've been in contact with him and Jonathan Cooper in the idea of writing grants as well. We've made the company a woman-owned company, so my daughter and a new employee are going to be basically the owners.
Great.
And so forth. So this is exciting to them and to us.
John, you were going to say something?
Well, I'll just acknowledge, Jerry, that like you and I have had some other conversations, and I'm definitely happy to have more. I know, I would, as in a consultative basis, that's something that we do on occasion. So just want to say I'm happy to sort of follow up and think more with you about that. I see Gisela. I see Gisela had a question here. I want to be sure to give some other folks an opportunity.
No, I just wanted to jump in with a comment, and also would like to thank Jenna again, who came to Pittsford a few years ago and did a fantastic job facilitating our first outreach with the community, and then which helped us to define some priority areas. So on the topic of outreach, we also had some lessons learned. For instance, at Pittsford Village Farm, we wanted to do some giant artwork, and we reached out to the community, and so many people hated it. So we scrapped the plan, and we didn't like the outcome, but it was such a great learning for us because we thought it was fantastic. But it's just very sort of, I guess it's very sort of liberal, like pie in the sky, happy girl. And I don't know, it was just not a artwork that did resonate with everybody. And now we want to even go a step further, and we hired a business plan consultant who will actually dig into the needs of the community and the economic viability of the project. And so at this point, we really feel that we really need to understand the community better before we move ahead. And you may not like what you learn, but this is a community center for the entire community. And so I just wanted to share that.
I just would weigh in response to both what Jerry said and your comments, Gisela, that you have the most important thing going for you, though, which is a commitment to your idea and that vision that you want to share with the community. And you do have to be prepared sometimes to fail. I've had that experience as well. But then you need to kind of stay the course and come back at it with what you learn and taking a different tack, which is, I think, what both of you are considering now. And so, you know, holding on to that idea and not giving up is a very important quality I would urge you to sustain.
I can add a little to that on the importance of getting to know your community. And one of the reasons for that is in our town, we have one particular individual who is highly influenced by hundreds of other people. So if you get them on board, you kind of get on a larger group of people to your project.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of that, David referenced this, some like surgical, tactical engagement. And it's hard because part of our principle, and this really depends on the process, because one of our principles is that all voices matter and that we try to put everybody on a level playing field in our community visit process. That's really important. Sometimes, though, you have to acknowledge that there are certain key voices that you go knock on that door and really, and the truth is, I think we do that in our community visit process every now and then. Sometimes it's reactive, where we find someone who is concerned and we will spend time with that person, maybe across a kitchen table, maybe on the phone with them, to really unpack what their concerns are and try to be responsive, because it's really important for people to understand that their voice matters and that they're heard in a conversation.
Yeah, I find sometimes people are surprised by that. Like they might have some critical comment out there on Front Porch Forum or whatever, and when you reach out to them and actually invite them, be like, hey, why don't you come to this next meeting so you can be like a part of it and have a conversation? It's surprising to them. They don't expect to be engaged in that way. And and almost always, they may not become the biggest fan of the process, but at least they feel that they've been heard and their opinion is respected, and they get a better sense that, like, as a facilitator, as someone managing a process, that they're important to you and you're considering these things. It's not like you're plowing forward without having considered those concerns, but you may be able to explain why, this is how we've structured it and here's what we're hoping or whatever. But it's often it ends up positive having those conversations.
It also is helpful to know when you need really professional help. When VCRD came into our town 3 years ago, I was challenged that, why you're bringing in these outside people, because we can do this ourselves. And my response, well, you've been here for eons, and if it could have been done yourselves, it would have been done yourself. And that was the key. And you need to know when to ask for the pros.
Well, and certainly there's some skills and experience of facilitation that a partner from outside can bring, but sometimes it's just having a third party come and be that sort of neutral conversation convener without carrying some of the baggage that someone within the community might have. And so sometimes that's part of the power. Sometimes is just being a third party. I see Danielle's got a hand up, so I want to be sure she has a chance here.
Hi, thank you. So my question is, and I was late jumping on and I might have missed this piece. I'm actually on a school board that's going through the process of a strategic plan. And one of the things it appears as though I think we're going to have to do some heavy lifting on is rebuilding the climate and culture within our community and our schools. And so it sounds like these are all some of the examples that you're giving are like physical, tangible items that you're actually building. And I was wondering if anybody had any insight or suggestions on how to sort of include engagement for something that's not actually touchable. You know what I mean?
I think so. I was using a lot of those kinds of examples, Danielle, but I should say I see communities through these processes that we are holding come to priorities that may to some feel kind of like softer, but are really important backbone, which are things like fostering community connection or building community unity. And so there are groups all around the state that I know of that are working on just that kind of thing. And in fact, it's so important. It creates a really critical backbone in a community. It creates those connections. It creates compassion and sympathy and trust among community members, and oftentimes will lead to a project in the end, right? Like a group will come together. Their goal is to foster community connection, but maybe over time it ends up being like an annual event that is bringing people, from all over the community, or a concert series or something like that. But anyway, just to say, I think that's where I loved, and I wish I had said it in mine, that idea of building in fun to a process is so important. And it doesn't need to be fun for the sake of a project. It can just be fun for the sake of fun in a community. I mentioned a facilitation we did for Chelsea, which was for a community store. But that didn't start as a community store conversation. That actually started as just a big community potluck where they were inviting everyone, and they'd have like 120 people in a tiny community would come together, bring food, there'd be music, they'd get together, and maybe they'd take a little portion of the meeting to say, hey, does anyone want to share ideas? Or put your ideas up on this board over here and, write them down, and we'll look at them, as we think about the future. And the community store idea came out of that. But the potluck was just to kind of build that sense of community. And so anyhow, I think what you're describing is important. And I think there are great, ways to bring people together, especially around food and events and connecting in that way, as well as oftentimes those group focus on communications too, like creating a community Facebook page and building out membership in Front Porch Forum and having a community website, or, those kinds of strategies.
Yeah, well, actually, one of the things that I wrote down in big letters and circled was the kiosk idea, that because I think that having, we have two communities that support the school system, and I was just trying to figure out ways to have, because we do have an older population, getting information out to people is not easy. Some people don't do Facebook, some people don't, it just always, there's these hurdles. But having some sort of a centerpiece in each community where they know they can go to get the information, I think would be helpful, and having that information updated in the pop-up events. So that was something that definitely resonated with me, that I thought was actually a physical structure that we could use to sort of generate that community and culture and start to move in that direction.
Danielle, two things I just want to tell you quickly. One of the more successful events we ever did with a community was in Newport in the 90s, when they were just starting to get their hands around revitalizing their downtown. And we held an event called the Taste of Newport. And we had gone around to all the restaurateurs in the area and said, hey, would you, be part of a table in the high school auditorium when people come to sort of provide food, and give an example of all the culinary treats that are available in the region. And I was told after the event that the turnout was the biggest ever in Newport, even exceeding their town meeting. And all it took was offering, good food to get people out the door. The other thing I want to mention is maybe I should try and get in touch with you offline, because my wife, who is a school board member here in the Addison Northwest District, just went through a strategic planning process with, I think, a pretty successful community engagement piece to it, that really kind of developed a strong vision and mission statement and went from there, not without controversy, because there always is, it seems, with school boards, but it was a very effective process, and I will follow up, and maybe through John or Jenna get a contact for you.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, just, it's hard when you're not actually building something or something, and like one of the things that resonated too is we have a small window to be able to sort of affect and engage. And I just want to make sure that we capitalize on that as much as we can. So anyways, thank you both very much for your input. I appreciate it.
And just two quick plugs on the school front. Three. One is, I think it's pretty hard to get sort of the general public engaged in something called strategic planning for a school district. Like, I'm just going to say it, like, general public is not going to be drawn in. So you got to come up with other vehicles like the fun stuff that just sort of draws people. You know, we go to communities all over the state, and I have to say, some schools are really welcoming and they appreciate the value of hosting community events in their facility, because it just gets people into the building, and that in and of itself is good and worthwhile. Not all schools have that posture, and I'm always a little confused by that. And then I guess the other thing I'd mention is, like, your students. I mean, you know, in Montpelier, we have the elementary school has the lip sync battle. And I tell you, the whole town comes out into the auditorium and watches those kids. And like those kinds of moments that schools can convene that I feel like no one else can, like are sort of part of that. And understanding that it's not all inward facing to the students and the parents and the teachers, that some of it's outward.
In Island Pond, we had a community dinner that was hosted at the school, and the 8th grade students put the dinner on, and they served the dinner, and they were going around filling up people's drinks, all that kind of stuff. And it just, like David was saying, like bringing kids and youth into the process, like this, it brings so much positivity and energy to the room.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I also thought about was, he was talking about doing tours, and I was like, that would be a great idea, because first of all, community has not been allowed in the schools for the last year and a half, really, of schools. Right. So, trying to sort of, pole vault into, reopening the schools, doing some sort of tours and doing some sort of an event that allows people to come back in. And I think that that's part of what we're seeing right now, as far as, people just feeling disconnected. But anyways, Thank you. I don't want to monopolize. I'm sure there's other people who have questions, but thank you very much.
Yeah, I saw Kevin, I think, had one, and we should probably wrap up after that, but Kevin, go for it.
Thanks, John. And thank you guys for putting this on. I'm really fortunate to have access to you. You are my favorite natural resource in Vermont. So, and I know that that from Ben Doyle before he left, and from talking to Paul a little bit in previous conversations, and with my parents who work with Nicole up in Swanton.
I was wondering if there was a connection there to the LandWorks.
Yeah, and
my favorite people.
I try to I try to downplay the perceived nepotism that might be associated with my position, but I wanted to thank you guys for giving this big agency, this big government behemoth, the street cred on the local level, because I know that talking to people in my role in public affairs for rural development, and then sitting on the Moncton Conservation Commission, it's really, really hard to toe the line between development and expansion. And when people hear rural development, they think PUDs, they think more housing, they think people want to build a downtown and draw new businesses, and that's what we want to do. So there's some conflict there. People want to retain the rural character of their towns and their villages. They want them to stay towns and villages. They don't want that lateral spread. They don't want vertical spread. So we talk about multi-use construction. We talk about new buildings on lots that aren't expanding but are tear downs. We try to kind of toe that psychological line. I was wondering if you guys have some good strategies for, kind of convincing the people who really want to keep their towns rural that you're not coming in to make their towns bigger necessarily. Sometimes you are. Sometimes that's the reality of it. And then there's also a growing and I think legitimate movement of challenging the growth paradigm itself. As we face climate change, as we face the inevitabilities of our impacts and our Western lifestyle, no growth seems to have some merit, seems to have some good ideas behind it, but of course runs contrary to everything that the established paradigm operates by. So sorry, it's not really a question, but the first one was, I'd love to hear any strategies about towing that line between defining rural development and expansion in general. Thanks.
I just have to say, I think Kevin has captured attention that, you know, we every now and then we refer to sort of various historical aspects of Vermont, and we're big fans of Paul Searles, the historian, and just like this tension around keeping what is versus creating something new has been here for a long, long time. And so I just want to sort of compliment you for naming sort of an overarching dynamic that we as a staff really grapple with.
I was going to say, I feel
constantly.
I wish that I had the answer to what you just described, because it's something that, yeah, we talk about all the time. I mean, internally and with our partners, it's I don't have the answer, although I have an answer. But David, it looked like you were like ready to chime in.
Well, I mean, I may be misunderstanding where you are in Moncton, Kevin. And by the way, my son is a Moncton resident, and
oh, nice.
my daughter-in-law is a native Monctonite from way back living
nice.
on Mount Road. You know, I think what you're talking about is a process whereby your community should look at visualizing different growth scenarios. You know, like what would, you know, Moncton Ridge look like if we added, you know, these number of housing units and these number of building units. I mean, you can sort of see Heinsberg having gone through that same process and ending up with a focus on a new town center. But, you know, going through a process, I mean, doing a build out analysis, people might be really blown away. And I'm sure you'd appreciate this coming from a conservation interest, at if you developed every lot that you could develop in Moncton, what would your town look like? It might, you know, might shock some people actually. So going through a couple of actual, you know, planning scenarios and visualizations and simulations to help people see the what ifs. What if we did no growth? What would happen then? Or what if we did modest growth? Or what if we let Moncton just, you know, grow without any zoning or constraints at all? And I think that would stimulate a really good conversation on where do we fall in between those scenarios.
Yeah, and that's a
real planning process.
It's a great point. And Moncton, just to be selfish geographically, is it benefits by bordering Heinsberg to the north, Bristol to the south, which you worked on. Those two examples of the kind of the bedroom communities, feeding Burlington, feeding Middlebury. And then you have Starksboro to the east and Charlotte, you know, and Ferrisburg to the west. And so those are more the rural examples of, well, Charlotte, not so much, but maybe Ferrisburg. Moncton, actually, my wife has spearheaded, and I got behind our new town hall and library, which is going right on Moncton Ridge. Beautiful new building. Took 4 tries at that bond vote. We did it last year. Yeah. We got the engagement. We were out. You know, we were hosting dinner parties. We were on Front Porch Forum. We were writing. We're both writers, so we were. You know, you got to buy ink by the barrel, right? But so there's still that facet. There's still that population that's really angry about that. You know, their property taxes went up. They're still talking about it. They wanted to start a petition, a recall, especially that COVID hit right when, you know, the bond was passed. And so we've actually overcome a lot of the stuff that I've talked about. But just in general, you know, with my work through the agency in these communities in New Hampshire and Vermont, seeing a lot of that, you know, seeing a lot of resistance, even if it's for a web project that really enables new businesses to liven up the town and give it some life and character. People don't want to spend money. They just don't want to spend money, and they don't have a lot of the foresight that you try to encourage and help them see. The visioning exercises, I'm real interested in that. I'd like to know more about how you do that.
So I hate to do this, but the three of us are expected in a VCRD meeting, I think 3 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Normally I would kind of let it roll.
Just got a call from Paul Costello.
Sorry about that.
Open it up.
You know, I do though just want to give Nick a really quick chance. You know, Nick lives this in Corinth quite a bit, this dynamic. So Nick, I don't know if you have anything to add as we bring this to a close.
Sure. I was just going to jump in and I'll keep it under 30 seconds. Kevin, what you're talking about is like my existential crisis du jour every day. The soundbite that I've had good success with talking to my friends and neighbors who really like hate the words of what I do is that like, I mean, this is just a glib little thing, take it or leave it, but like that when a 5-year-old turns 6, like that's development, right? That's a kind of development. It's still the same 5-year-old, but it's just aging and it's inevitable and it sort of happens to all of us. So like, totally agree getting away from that like growth mindset or bigger or better. And we're not getting bigger or better. I mean, we're getting older and smaller actually where I live, but like we are getting older, right? So how do we like move into that future in a way that like we want to?
That's a great analogy. I really like that. Thanks. I'll use that, Nick.
All right, I feel like that's a great point to end on. I really want to thank you, David, for joining us and presenting, and Jenna too, and all of you. Like, it's clear from this conversation, like this is something that is really important and worth talking about and worth working on. We are always at VCRD, we say this all the time, we're never done. Like this, there is no perfect when it comes to this job. And frankly, every